Good evening and welcome back to Evelina, and happy Easter to all who celebrate. Letter the 50th. Evelina to the Reverend Mr. Villiers. Holborn, 27th June. I have just received, my dearest sir, your kind present and still kinder letter. Surely never had orphan so little to regret as your grateful Evelina. Though motherless, though worse than fatherless, bereft from infancy of the two first and greatest blessings of life, never has she had cause to deplore their loss. Never has she felt the omission of a parent's tenderness, care, or indulgence. Never, but from sorrow for them, had reason to grieve at the situation. Most thankfully do I receive the token of your approbation, and most studiously will I endeavour so to dispose of it as may merit your generous confidence in my conduct. Your doubts concerning Mr. Macartney give me some uneasiness. Indeed, sir, he has not the appearance of a man whose sorrows are the effect of guilt. But I hope, before I leave town, to be better acquainted with his situation, and enabled, with more certainty of his worth, to recommend him to your favour. I am very willing to relinquish all acquaintance with Sir Clement Willoughby, as far as it may depend upon myself so to do, but indeed I know not how I should be able to absolutely forbid him my sight. Miss Mervyn, in her last letter, informs me that he is now at Howard Grove, where he continues in high favour with the captain, and is the life and spirit of the house. My time since I wrote last has passed very quietly, Madame Duval having been kept at home by a bad cold, and the Brangtons by bad weather. The young man, indeed, has called 2 or 3 times, and his behaviour, though equally absurd, is more unaccountable than ever. He speaks very little, takes hardly any notice of Madame Duval, and never looks at me without a broad grin. Sometimes he approaches me as if with the intention of to communicate intelligence of importance, and then suddenly stopping short, laughs rudely in my face. Oh, how happy shall I be when the worthy Mrs. Clinton arrives. 29th June. Yesterday morning Mr. Smith called to acquaint us that the Hampstead Assembly was to be held that evening, and then he presented Madame Duval with 1 ticket, and brought another to me. I thanked him for his intended civility, but told him I was surprised he had so soon forgotten my having already declined going to the ball. "Lord, ma'am," cried he, "how should I suppose you was in earnest? Come, come, don't be cross. Here's your grandmamma ready to take care of you, so you can have no further objection, for she'll see that I don't run away with you. Besides, ma'am, I got the tickets on purpose." "If you were determined, sir," said I, "in making me this offer, to allow me no choice of refusal or acceptance, I must think myself less obliged to your intention than I was willing to do." "Dear ma'am," cried he, "you're so smart, there is no speaking to you. Indeed, you are monstrous smart, madam. But come, your grandmamma shall ask you, and then I know you'll not be so cruel." Madame Duval was very ready to interfere. She desired me to make no further opposition, said she should go herself, and insisted upon my accompanying her. It was in vain that I remonstrated. I only incurred her anger, and Mr. Smith, having given both the tickets to Madame Duval with an air of triumph, said he would call early in the evening, and took leave. I was much chagrined at being thus compelled to owe even the shadow of an obligation to so forward a young man, but I determined that nothing should prevail upon me to dance with him, however my refusal might give offence. In the afternoon, when he returned, it was evident that he proposed to both charm and astonish me by his appearance. He was dressed in a very showy manner, but without any taste, and the inelegant smartness of his air and deportment, his visible struggle against education to put on the fine gentleman, added to his frequent conscious glances at a dress to which he was but little accustomed, very effectively destroyed his aim of figuring, and rendered all his effects useless. During tea entered Miss Brangton and her brother. I was sorry to observe the consternation of the former when she perceived Mr. Smith. I had intended applying to her for advice upon this occasion, but had been always deterred by her disagreeable abruptness. Having cast her eyes several times from Mr. Smith to me with manifest displeasure, she seated herself sullenly in the window, scarcely answering Madame Duval's inquiries, and when I spoke to her, turning absolutely away from me. Mr. Smith, delighted at this mark of his importance, sat indolently quiet on his chair, endeavouring by his looks rather to display than to conceal his inward satisfaction. "Good gracious!" cried young Brangton. "Why, you're all as fine as 5 pence. Why, where are you going?" "To the Hampstead ball." answered Mr. Smith. To a ball? Cried he. Why, what is aunt going to a ball? Ha! Yes, to be sure, cried Madame Duval. I don't know nothing need hinder me. And pray, aunt, will you dance too? Perhaps I may, but I suppose, sir, that's none of your business whether I go or not. Lord, well, I should like to go. I should like to see aunt dance of all things, but the joke is I don't believe she'll get either a partner. You're the rudest boy ever I see, cried Madame Duval angrily, but I promise you, I'll tell your father what you say, for I've no notion of such vulgarness. Why, Lord, aunt, what are you so angry for? There's no speaking a word but you fly into a passion. You're as bad as Biddy or Poll for that, for you're always a scolding. I desire, Tom, cried Miss Brangton, you'd speak for yourself, and not make so free with my name. There now, she's up. There's nothing but quarrelling with the women. It's my belief they like it better than victuals and drink. Fie, Tom, cried Mr. Smith. You never remember your manners before the ladies. I'm sure you never heard me speak so rude to them. Why, Lord, you're a beau, but that's nothing to me. So if you've a mind, you may be so polite as to dance with aunt yourself. Then, with a loud laugh, he declared it would be good fun to see them. Let it be never so good or never so bad, cried Madame Duval. You won't see nothing of it, I promise you. So pray don't let me hear no more of such vulgar pieces of fun, for I assure you I don't like it. And as to my dancing with Mr. Smith, you may see wonderfuller things than that any day in the week. Why, as to that, ma'am, said Mr. Smith, looking much surprised, I always thought you intended to play at cards, and so I thought to dance with the young lady. I gladly seized this opportunity to make my declaration that I should not dance at all. Not dance at all? Repeated Miss Brangton. Yes, that's a likely matter truly when people go to balls. I wish you mayn't, said the brother, because then Mr. Smith will have nobody but aunt for a partner. Lord, how mad he'll be. Oh, as to that, said Mr. Smith, I don't at all fear of prevailing with the young lady, if once I get her to the room. Indeed, sir, cried I, much offended by his conceit, you are mistaken, and therefore I beg leave to undeceive you, as you may be assured my resolution will not alter. Then pray, miss, if it is not impertinent, cried Miss Brangton sneeringly, what do you go for? Merely and solely, answered I, to comply with the request of Madame Duval. Miss, cried young Brangton, Bid only wishes it was she, for she has cast a sheep's eye at Mr. Smith this long while. Tom, cried her sister, rising, I've the greatest mind in the world to box your ears. How dare you say such a thing of me? No, hang it, Tom, no, that's wrong, said Mr. Smith, simpering. It is indeed, to tell the ladies' secrets. But never mind him, Miss Biddy, for I won't believe him. Why, I know Bid would give her ears to go, returned the brother, but only Mr. Smith likes Miss best, so does everybody else. Well, the sifter gave him a very angry answer. Mr. Smith said to me in a low voice, Why now, ma'am, how can you be so cruel as to be so much handsomer than your cousins? Nobody can look at them when you are by. Miss, cried young Brangton, whatever he says to you, don't mind him, for he means no good. I'll give you my word for it, he'll never marry you, for he has told me again and again he'll never marry as long as he lives. Besides, if he'd any mind to be married, then Bid would have had him a long time ago, and thanked him too. Come, come, Tom, don't tell secrets, you'll make the ladies afraid of me. But I assure you, lowering his voice, if I did marry, it should be your cousin. Should be? Did you ever, my dear sir, hear such unauthorized freedom? I looked at him with a contempt I did not wish to repress, and walked to the other end of the room. Very soon after, Mr. Smith sent for a hackney coach. When I would have taken leave of Miss Brangton, she turned angrily from me without making any answer. She supposes, perhaps, that I have rather sought than endeavoured to avoid the notice and civilities of this conceited young man. The ball was at the Long Room at Hampstead. This room seems very well named, for I believe it would be difficult to find any other epithet which might, with propriety, distinguish it, as it is without ornament, elegance, or any sort of singularity, and merely to be marked by its length. I was saved from the importunities of Mr. Smith, the beginning of the evening, by Madame Duval's declaring her intention to dance the first 2 dances with him herself. Mr. Smith's chagrin was very evident, but as she paid no regard to it, he was necessitated to lead her out. I was, however, by no means pleased, when she said she was determined to dance a minuet. Indeed, I was quite astonished, not having had the least idea she would have consented to, much less proposed, such an exhibition of her person. She had some trouble to make her intention known, as Mr. Smith was rather averse to speaking to the master of the ceremonies. During this minuet, how much did I rejoice in being surrounded only with strangers! She danced in a style so uncommon. Her age, her showy dress, and an unusual quantity of rouge, drew upon her the eyes, and I fear the derision of the whole company. Who she danced with I know not, but Mr. Smith was so ill-bred as to laugh at her very openly, and to speak of her with as much ridicule as was in his power. But I would neither look at nor listen to him, nor would I suffer him to proceed with the speech which he began, expressive of his vexation at being forced to dance with her. I told him, very gravely, that complaints upon such a subject might, with less impropriety, be made to every person in the room than to me. When she returned to us, she distressed me very much by asking what I thought of her minuet. I spoke as civilly as I could, but the coldness of my compliment evidently disappointed her. She then called upon Mr. Smith to secure a good place among the country dancers, and away they went, though not before he had taken the liberty to say to me in a low voice, "I protest to you, ma'am, I should be quite out of countenance if any of my acquaintance should see me dancing with the old lady." For a few moments I very much rejoiced at being relieved from this troublesome man, but scarce had I time to congratulate myself before I was accosted by another, who begged the favour of hopping a dance with me. I told him that I should not dance at all, but he thought proper to importune me very freely not to be so cruel, and I was obliged to assume no little haughtiness before I could satisfy him I was serious. After this I was addressed much in the same manner by several other young men, of whom the appearance and language were equally inelegant and low-bred, so that I soon found my situation was both disagreeable and improper, since as I was quite alone, I fear I must seem rather to invite than to forbid the offers and notice I received. And yet, so great was my apprehension of this interpretation, that I am sure, my dear sir, you would have laughed had you seen how proudly grave I appeared. I know not whether to be glad or sorry when Madame Duval and Mr. Smith returned. The latter instantly renewed his tiresome entreaties, and Madame Duval said she would go to the card-table, and as soon as she was accommodated, she desired us to join the dancers. I will not trouble you with the arguments which followed. Mr. Smith teased me till I was weary of resistance, and I should at last have been obliged to submit, had I not fortunately recollected the affair of Mr. Lovell, and told my persecutor that it was impossible I should dance with him, even if I wished it, as I had refused several persons in his absence. He was not contented with being extremely chagrined, but took the liberty openly and warmly to expostulate with me upon not having said I was engaged. The total disregard with which involuntarily I heard him made him soon change the subject. In truth, I had no power to attend him at all, for all my thoughts were occupied in retracing the transactions of the 2 former balls at which I had been present. The party, the conversation, the company. Oh, how great the contrast! In a short time, however, he contrived to draw my attention to himself by his extreme impertinence, for he chose to express what he called his admiration of me, in terms so open and familiar that he forced me to express my displeasure with equal plainness. But how was I surprised when I found he had the temerity, what else can I call it, to impute my resentment to doubts of his honour, for he said, "My dear ma'am, you must be a little patient. I assure you I have no bad designs. I have not, upon my word, but really there's no resolving upon such a thing as matrimony all at once, what with the loss of one's liberty, and what with the ridicule of all one's acquaintance. I assure you, ma'am, you are the first lady who ever made me even demur upon this subject, for after all, my dear ma'am, marriage is the devil." "Your opinion, sir," answered I, "of either the married or the single life, can be of no manner of consequence to me, and therefore I would by no means trouble you to discuss their different merits." "Why, really, ma'am, as to your being a little out of sorts, I must own I can't wonder at it, for to be sure marriage is all in all with the ladies, but with us gentlemen it's quite another thing. Now, only put yourself in my place. Suppose you had a large acquaintance of gentlemen, as I have, and that you had always been used to appear a little smart among them. Why now, how should you like to let yourself down all at once into a married man?" I could not tell what to answer. So much conceit and so much ignorance both astonished and silenced me. "I assure you, ma'am," added he, "there's not only Miss Biddy, though I should have scorned to mention her if her brother hadn't blabbed, for I'm very particular in keeping ladies' secrets, but there are a great many other ladies that have been proposed to me, but I never thought twice of any of them. That is, not in a serious way. So you may very well be proud," offering to take my hand, "for I assure you there is nobody so likely to catch me at last as yourself." "Sir," cried I, drawing myself back as haughtily as I could, "you are totally mistaken if you imagine you have given me any pride I felt not before by this conversation. On the contrary, you must allow me to tell you, I find it too humiliating to bear with it any longer." I then placed myself behind the chair of Madame Duval, who, when she heard of the partners I had refused, pitied my ignorance of the world, but no longer insisted upon my dancing. Indeed, the extreme vanity of this man makes me exert a spirit which I did not till now know that I possessed, but I cannot endure that he should think me at his disposal. The rest of the evening passed very quietly, as Mr. Smith did not again attempt speaking to me, except, indeed, after we had left the room, and while Madame Duval was seating herself in the coach, he said in a voice of pique, "Next time I take the trouble to get any tickets for a young lady, I'll make it bargain beforehand that she shan't turn me over to her grandmother." We came home very safe, and thus ended this so long projected and most disagreeable affair. Letter the 51st. Evelina in continuation. I have just received a most affecting letter from Mr. Macartney. I will enclose it, my dear sir, for your perusal. More than ever have I cause to rejoice that I was able to assist him. Mr. Macartney to Miss Anville. Madam, impressed with the deepest, the most heartfelt sense of the exalted humanity with which you have rescued from destruction an unhappy stranger, allow me, with the humblest gratitude, to offer you my fervent acknowledgments, and to implore your pardon for the terror I have caused you. You bid me, madam, live. I have now indeed a motive for life, since I should not willingly quit the world, while I withhold from the needy and distressed any share of that charity which a disposition so noble would otherwise bestow upon them. The benevolence with which you have interested yourself in my affairs induces me to suppose you would wish to be acquainted with the cause of that desperation from which you snatched me, and the particulars of that misery of which you have so wonderfully been a witness. Yet as this explanation will require that I should divulge secrets of a nature the most delicate, I must entreat you to regard them as sacred, even though I forbear to mention the names of the parties concerned. I was brought up in Scotland, though my mother, who had the sole care of me, was an Englishwoman, and had not one relation in that country. She devoted to me her whole time. The retirement in which we lived, and the distance from our natural friends, she often told me were the effect of an unconquerable melancholy, with which she was seized, upon the sudden loss of my father some time before I was born. At Aberdeen, where I finished my education, I formed a friendship with a young man of fortune, which I considered as the chief happiness of my life. But when he quitted his studies, I considered it as my chief misfortune, for he immediately prepared, by direction of his friends, to make a tour of Europe. As I was designed for the church, and had no prospect even of maintenance but from my own industry, I scarce dared permit even a wish of accompanying him. It is true he would joyfully have borne my expenses, but my affection was as free from meanness as his own, and I made a determination the most solemn never to lessen its dignity by submitting to pecuniary obligations. We corresponded with great regularity, and the most unbounded confidence, for the space of 2 years, when he arrived at Lyons on his way home. He wrote me thence the most pressing invitation to meet him at Paris, where he intended to remain some time. My desire to comply with his request and shorten our absence was so earnest, that my mother, too indulgent to control me, lent me what assistance was in her power, and in an ill-fated moment I set out for that capital. My meeting with this dear friend was the happiest event of my life. He introduced me to all his acquaintance, and so quickly did time seem to pass at that delightful period, that the 6 weeks I had allotted for my stay were gone ere I was sensible I had missed so many days. But I must now own that the company of my friend was not the sole subject of my felicity. I became acquainted with a young lady, daughter of an Englishman of distinction, with whom I formed an attachment which I have 1,000 times vowed, 1,000 times sincerely thought would be as lasting as my life. She had but just quitted a convent in which she had been placed when a child, and though English by birth, she could scarcely speak her native language. Her person and disposition were equally engaging, but chiefly I adored her for the greatness of the expectations which for my sake she was willing to resign. When the time for my residence in Paris expired, I was almost distracted at the idea of quitting her. Yet I had not the courage to make our attachment known to her father, who might reasonably form for her such views as would make him reject, with a contempt which I could not bear to think of, such an offer as mine. Yet I had free access to the house, where she seemed to be left almost wholly to the guidance of an old servant, who was my fast friend. But, to be brief, the sudden and unexpected return of her father one fatal afternoon proved the beginning of the misery which has ever since devoured me. I doubt not but he had listened to our conversation, for he darted into the room with the rage of a madman. Heavens, what a scene followed! What abusive language did the shame of the clandestine affair, and the consciousness of acting ill, induce me to brook! At length, however, his fury exceeded my patience. He called me a beggarly, cowardly Scotchman. Fired at the words, I drew my sword. He, with equal alertness, drew his, for he was not an old man, but on the contrary strong and able as myself. In vain his daughter pleaded. In vain did I, repentant of my anger, retreat. His reproaches continued. Myself, my country, were loaded with infamy, till, no longer constraining my rage, we fought, and he fell. At that moment I could almost have destroyed myself. The young lady fainted with terror. The old servant, drawn to us by the noise of the scuffle, entreated me to escape, and promised to bring intelligence of what should pass to my apartment. The disturbance which I heard raised in the house obliged me to comply, and in a state of mind inconceivably wretched, I tore myself away. My friend, whom I found at home, soon discovered the whole affair. It was near midnight before the woman came. She told me that her master was living, and her young mistress restored to her senses. The absolute necessity for my leaving Paris, while any danger remained, was forcibly urged by my friend. The servant promised to acquaint him of whatever passed, and he to transmit to me her information. Thus circumstanced, with the assistance of this dear friend, I effected my departure from Paris, and not long after I returned to Scotland. I would fain have stopped by the way, that I might have been nearer the scene of all my concerns, but the low state of my finances denied me that satisfaction. The miserable situation of my mind was soon discovered by my mother, nor would she rest till I communicated the cause. She heard my whole story with an agitation which astonished me. The name of the parties concerned seemed to strike her with horror. But when I said, "We fought and he fell," "My son," cried she, "you have then murdered your father!" And she sank breathless at my feet. Comments, madam, upon such a scene as this would to you be superfluous, and to me agonizing. I cannot, for both our sakes, be too concise. When she recovered, she confessed all the particulars of a tale which she had hoped never to have revealed. Alas, the loss she had sustained in my father was not by death. Bound to her by no ties but those of honour, he had voluntarily deserted her. Her settling in Scotland was not the effect of choice. She was banished thither by a family but too justly incensed. Pardon, madam, that I cannot be more explicit. My senses, in the greatness of my misery, actually forsook me, and for more than a week I was wholly delirious. My unfortunate mother was yet more to be pitied, for she pined with unmitigated sorrow, eternally reproaching herself for the danger to which her too strict silence had exposed me. When I recovered my reason, my impatience to hear from Paris almost deprived me of it again, and though the length of time I waited for letters might justly be attributed to contrary winds, I could not bear the delay, and was 20 times upon the point of returning thither at all hazards. At length, however, several letters arrived at once, and from the most insupportable of my afflictions I was then relieved, for they acquainted me that the horrors of parricide were not in reserve for me. They informed me also that as soon as the wound was healed, a journey would be made to England, where my unhappy sister was to be received by an aunt with whom she was to live. The intelligence somewhat quieted the violence of my sorrows. I instantly formed a plan of meeting them in London, and by revealing the whole dreadful story, convincing this irritated parent that he had nothing more to apprehend from his daughter's unfortunate choice. My mother consented, and gave me a letter to prove the truth of my assertions. As I could but ill afford to make this journey, I travelled in the cheapest way that was possible. I took an obscure lodging, I need not, madam, tell you where, and boarded with the people of the house. Here I languished week after week, vainly hoping for the arrival of my family, but my impetuosity had blinded me to the imprudence of which I was guilty in quitting Scotland so hastily. My wounded father, after his recovery, relapsed, and when I had waited in the most comfortless situation for 6 weeks, my friend wrote me word that the journey was yet deferred for some time longer. My finances were then nearly exhausted, and I was obliged, though most unwillingly, to beg further assistance from my mother, that I might return to Scotland. Oh, madam, my answer was not from herself. It was written by a lady who had long been her companion, and acquainted me that she had been taken suddenly ill of a fever, and was no more. The compassionate nature of which you have given such noble proofs assures me I need not, if I could, paint to you the anguish of a mind overwhelmed by such accumulated sorrows. Enclosed was a letter to a near relation, which she had during her illness with much difficulty written, and in which, with the strongest maternal tenderness, she described my deplorable situation, and entreated his interest to procure me some preferment. Yet so sunk was I by misfortune, that a fortnight elapsed before I had the courage or spirit to attempt delivering this letter. I was then compelled to it by want. To make my appearance with some decency, I was necessitated myself to the melancholy task of changing my coloured clothes for a suit of mourning, and then I proceeded to seek my relation. I was informed he was not in town. In this desperate situation, the pride of my heart, which hitherto had not bowed to adversity, gave way, and I determined to entreat the assistance of my friend, whose offered services I had 1,000 times rejected. Yet, madam, so hard is it to root from the mind its favoured principles or prejudices, call them what you please, that I lingered another week ere I had the resolution to send away a letter which I regarded as the death of my independence. At length, reduced to my last shilling, dunned insolently by the people of the house, and almost famished, I sealed this fated letter, and with a heavy heart determined to take it to the post office. But Mr. Brangton and his son suffered me not to pass through the shop with impunity. They insulted me grossly, and threatened me with imprisonment if I did not immediately satisfy their demands. Stung to the soul, I bade them have but a day's patience, and flung from them in a state of mind too terrible for description. My letter, which I now found would be received too late to save me from disgrace, I tore into 1,000 pieces, and scarce could I refrain from putting an instantaneous and unlicensed period to my existence. In this disorder of my senses, I formed the horrible plan of turning footpad, for which purpose I returned to my lodgings, and collected whatever of my apparel I could part with, which I immediately sold, and with the profits purchased a brace of pistols, powder, and shot. I hope, however, you will believe me when I most solemnly assure you my sole intention was to frighten the passengers I should assault with these dangerous weapons, which I had not loaded, but from a resolution, a dreadful one I own, to save myself from an ignominious death if seized. And indeed, I thought that if I could but procure money sufficient to pay Mr. Brangton and make a journey to Scotland, I should soon be able, by the public papers, to discover whom I had injured, and to make private retribution. But, madam, new to every species of villainy, my perturbation was so great that I could with difficulty support myself, yet the Brangtons observed it not as I passed through the shop. Here I stop. What followed is better known to yourself. But no time can ever efface from my memory that moment, when in the very action of preparing for my own destruction, or the lawless seizure of the property of others, you rushed into the room and arrested my arm. It was, indeed, an awful moment. The hand of Providence seemed to intervene between me and eternity. I beheld you as an angel. I thought you dropped from the clouds. The earth, indeed, had never presented to my view a form so celestial. What wonder, then, that a spectacle so astonishing should, to a man disordered as I was, appear too beautiful to be human? And now, madam, that I have performed this painful task, the more grateful one remains of rewarding, as far as it is in my power, your generous goodness, by assuring you it shall not be thrown away. You have awakened me to a sense of the false pride by which I have been actuated, a pride which, while it scorned assistance from a friend, scrupled not to compel it from a stranger, though at the hazard of reducing that stranger to a situation as destitute as my own. Yet, oh, how violent was the struggle which tore my conflicting soul, ere I could persuade myself to profit by the benevolence which you were so evidently disposed to exert in my favour. By means of a ring, the gift of my much regretted mother, I have for the present satisfied Mr. Brangton, and by means of your compassion I hope to support myself, either till I hear from my friend, to whom at length I have written, or till the relation of my mother returns to town. To talk to you, madam, of paying my debt would be vain. I never can. The service you have done me exceeds all power of return. You have restored me to my senses. You have taught me to curb those passions which bereft me of them, and since I cannot avoid calamity, to bear it as a man. An interposition so wonderfully circumstanced can never be recollected without benefit. Yet allow me to say the pecuniary part of my obligation must be settled by my first ability. I am, madam, with the most profound respect and heartfelt gratitude, your obedient and devoted humble servant, J. Macartney. Well, melodrama indeed, my friends. This is taking a bit of a digression into Star Wars territory, I think, but fortunately parricide itself is avoided. I was thinking when I was reading about the scene earlier on, though, between Mr. Smith and Evelina, and something occurs to me, and I wonder what you think, but why do people like Evelina? I mean, we know that she's intelligent, and she's beautiful, and I suppose beauty is a great attraction to silly young men, but she's very rude. I mean, not rude in the way the Brangtons are, but she keeps shutting everyone down. She doesn't go along with anyone's plans. She makes herself quite obviously disagreeable by her coldness and her retorts. Why do people pursue her? Do they know that she's intended to be Madame Duval's heiress? It doesn't seem that that's not mentioned in what she says. It just seems to me that no matter how pretty she is, there are easier targets, or maybe that's it. Maybe these silly young men not only want beauty, but they also want difficulty in attaining that beauty. I don't know, but it's just something I was wondering about there. And also the way Mr. Smith's discussion of marriage, that whole sort of, it's so similar to what you hear, rather unfortunately, this rather misogynistic attitude of certain men when they're getting married, of saying, oh, the old ball and chain, and the idea that, marriage is some sort of torturous prison, which, of course begs the question, why in the world are you getting married if that's your attitude? But I guess there's nothing new under the sun, because Mr. Smith seems to have that exact opinion. Anyway, enough of my talking to the camera. It's Easter Sunday over here for me. I hope you have a very lovely and peaceful day. Good night.